I, Elias Thorn, schoolmaster of the remote Adirondack settlement of Blackwood, set down this account in the final year of my life, that truth might not perish with my bones. What I have witnessed defies all understanding and challenges the very foundations of our faith in an ordered universe. This is the testament of Alistair Finch, a boy whose soul was claimed by a darkness beyond medicine or theology, a case that remains, to this day, unexplained by any science known to man. Let no man who reads this account dismiss it as fancy, for I swear upon my hope of salvation that every word is true, and that the horror which began in our small community remains a threat to any who would underestimate the capacity for evil that can dwell in the human heart. In the spring of 1865, Blackwood was a community defined by its isolation and its stern Protestant virtues. Nestled in a valley perpetually draped in the shadows of ancient pines, we lived by the rhythm of the axe and the saw, our lives measured in cordwood and prayer. The world beyond our mountains was a distant rumor, and we preferred it that way, for we had seen enough of progress and industry to know that it often came at the cost of a man's soul. Our village consisted of a single muddy street flanked by clapboard houses, a white-steepled church, my schoolhouse, and the great timber mill owned by Arthur Finch. The Finches were the first family of Blackwood in every sense. Arthur, a man of formidable build and unyielding principle, had built his empire from nothing, his hands as rough as the bark he stripped from the ancient trees. His wife, Eleanor, was the village's gentle heart, a delicate woman from Albany who had scandalized her family by marrying a frontiersman and whose watercolor paintings of wildflowers were small, cherished rebellions of beauty against our rugged existence. Their son, Alistair, born that very spring, was a child of golden-haired robustness, the embodiment of their hopes and the community's future. I remember him in his mother's arms after his christening, a picture of innocence against the grim backdrop of our wilderness. For 8 years, he developed as any child in our remote corner of the world. He was quiet, certainly, given to long, still observations of the world from the porch of their clapboard house, but we attributed this to a thoughtful, perhaps even poetic, nature. In my one-room schoolhouse, filled with the sense of pinewood and chalk dust, he learned his letters and his scripture with a swift, silent aptitude that pleased me. He could recite psalms with a clarity that belied his years, and his sums were always perfect. There was a placidity to him, a stillness that, in retrospect, was not peace but the awful calm of deep, untroubled waters. He played with the other children, though he was never the instigator of their games, always the quiet participant, his pale blue eyes missing nothing. His father, proud of his son's quiet dignity, would often say, "That boy has an old soul," and we all nodded in agreement, fools that we were. The first fissure in this placid facade appeared in the autumn of 1873, a season of particularly vibrant decay. The change was not a sudden explosion, but a gradual chilling, like the slow advance of dusk. It began with his questions. Where other boys asked about hunting techniques or the workings of a steam engine, Alistair's inquiries turned singularly toward the terminus of life. After a lesson on natural philosophy, he approached my desk, the scent of chalk and wet wool clinging to him. The other children had filed out, their laughter fading into the crisp afternoon. "Master Thorn," he began, his voice unervingly even, devoid of a child's musical lilt. "The Bible tells us the Lord marks the fall of a sparrow. But does it specify the mechanism? If one were to crush the bird in one's hand, at what point does the skeleton yield? Is it the ribs first, or the fragile bones of the wings? And does the sound differ if the pressure is applied slowly rather than with a sudden force?" I was taken aback, my quill poised above a half-graded spelling test. "Alistair," I said, striving for a tone of gentle correction, "such thoughts are unseemly. We must respect God's creatures, not ponder their destruction." He blinked, his expression one of pure, uncomprehending curiosity. "But is not understanding a form of respect, Master Thorn? To know how something is made is to appreciate its design. And to know how it unmakes is to understand its limits." I chided him again, more firmly this time, and sent him on his way. But the questions persisted, each one more precise, more unsettling. He inquired after the viscosity of blood at different temperatures, the time it took for a man to bleed out from a severed femoral artery, and whether the sound of a breaking neck differed between a child and a grown man. His essays, once models of grammatical precision, began to feature disturbingly detailed descriptions of historical battles, focusing not on the strategy or the heroism, but on the specific wounds inflicted by various period weapons. His mother, her once serene face now etched with a perpetual, faint worry, confided in me one evening after church, her voice a hushed tremor in the vestry. She had found him in the kitchen garden, holding the family's tabby cat, Jem. He was not petting it, nor was he playing. He had it pinned gently but firmly to the ground, his face inches from its own, staring into its wide, fearful eyes. He asked me, "Mother, can you see the fear in its eyes? I wonder what it sees in mine." Eleanor's hands twisted in the fabric of her Sunday dress, her knuckles white. He wasn't angry, Master Thorn. There was no malice in him. He was curious. It was a scholar's curiosity, but directed at a living soul in terror. It was the most unnatural thing I have ever witnessed. This scholarly detachment began to manifest in his play. The other boys played stickball and tag in the village square. Alistair began constructing elaborate structures from twigs, pine needles, and river clay at the forest's edge. At first glance, they appeared as childish forts or castles. But upon closer inspection, their architecture was all wrong. They were not designed for defense or habitation, but were complex, spiraling labyrinths with no exit, or models that bore a disturbing resemblance to the human circulatory system, or, as old Mr. Hemlock, the gravedigger, once muttered under his breath after seeing one, the vaults of a bone church. The other children sensed this shift before the adults did. They did not taunt him or exclude him out of malice. Rather, they began to drift away from him instinctively, as a herd senses a predator whose form it cannot yet see. Invitations to birthday gatherings ceased. His name was no longer called in teams for games. He became a solitary figure, a small, still statue in the periphery of our village life, watching, always watching. The boy I had known, the quiet, promising student, was fading, and what was emerging in his place was a cold, patient, and deeply unsettling intelligence that regarded the world not as a place to live, but as a complex puzzle of suffering and structural failure. The shadow had fallen over Blackwood, and we, in our rustic innocence, had failed to recognize its shape, mistaking the gathering gloom for a simple change in the weather of a boy's soul. The winter of 1873-74 was one of unprecedented severity, even for our hardened community. Snow fell in great, relentless shrouds, isolating Blackwood from the world more completely than ever before. The mill's operations ceased, and the village settled into a hushed existence, the only sounds being the crackle of hearth fires and the mournful wind howling down from the frozen peaks. It was during this period of enforced isolation that Alistair's transformation accelerated, moving from disturbing curiosity to tangible action. The first concrete incident occurred in late January. Young Timothy Shaw, the butcher's son, came running to my door one afternoon, his face ashen with a terror that had nothing to do with the cold. He stammered out a tale of having followed Alistair into the old pine grove behind the church, a place the children usually avoided after dusk. There, in a small clearing dusted with snow, he had witnessed Alistair kneeling beside the body of a large timber wolf. The beast, a magnificent creature feared and respected by all in the valley, was dead. But it was not the work of a hunter's rifle. "It weren't shot, Master Thorn," Timothy whispered, his breath pluming in my frozen parlor. "It were opened up, like in a doctor's book. And Alistair, he had his hands in it. He was looking at all its parts, moving them around. And he was hummin'." I pressed him, my own blood running cold. "Humming what, boy?" "A hymn, sir." "There is a fountain filled with blood." I confronted Arthur Finch that very evening. The great man, usually so commanding, seemed to have shrunk within his own home. The air in the Finch parlor was thick with the scent of beeswax and a new, unnameable tension. Eleanor sat silently by the fire, her embroidery lying forgotten in her lap, her eyes red-rimmed. Arthur admitted, his voice heavy with shame and confusion, that he had discovered similar, smaller atrocities. A nest of field mice disassembled with surgical precision on the woodshed floor. A prized hunting hound found listless and bleeding from a series of small, precise cuts along its legs, as if someone had been testing its pain tolerance. He claims he is conducting experiments, Arthur said, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He speaks of it with the same passion other boys speak of fishing or trapping. I have whipped him, I have locked him in his room, I have prayed with him until my knees were raw. It makes no difference. The moment he is free, he returns to it. It is as if he is compelled. The village, bound by its strict moral code and a deep-seated fear of the unknown, did not know how to react. We were a people who understood broken bones and fevers, sin and repentance. We had no lexicon for this. The Reverend Mathis preached a sermon on the corruption of the soul and the importance of vigilant parenting, his words causing many a parent to cast suspicious glances at the Finch family pew, which now stood conspicuously empty. A subtle but firm boundary was erected around the Finch household. Neighbors who had once stopped by for tea now crossed the street to avoid them. The children, taking their cue from their parents, now fled at the very sight of Alistair, their fear having crystallized into outright terror. It was during this time that I saw the change in Alistair's countenance most clearly. He no longer attempted to engage with other children, nor did he offer any explanations for his behavior. When he attended my schoolhouse, which became less and less frequent, he would sit perfectly still, his hands folded on the desk, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that was unnerving. He was still brilliant. He could solve complex arithmetic problems in his head and recite long passages from the classics. But his essays had become treatises on decomposition, on the structural weaknesses of the human body, on the efficiency of various poisons derived from local flora. I tried to redirect him, to force him to write about virtue, about beauty, about God's love. He would comply, producing perfectly structured, grammatically flawless compositions that were as cold and lifeless as a stone. They were mimicry, devoid of any true understanding or feeling. The final thread of his connection to our community snapped on a bitter morning in early March. The snows had begun to thaw, revealing the grim detritus of winter. A group of children discovered the remains of a dozen or more squirrels and birds arranged in a bizarre, spiral pattern on the frozen bank of the creek. They were not merely dead. They had been posed, their tiny bodies forming a grotesque mockery of a sundial, their sightless eyes all pointing toward the center where a single larger crow had been impaled on a sharpened stick. There was no proof it was Alistair's work. No one had seen him do it. But in the collective mind of Blackwood, there was no doubt. He had become a pariah, a monster in their midst. Arthur Finch, seeing the writing on the wall and fearing for his family's safety, withdrew Alistair from my school. The boy vanished from our daily view, confined to the Finch property, a prisoner in his own home. But we all felt, with a certainty that chilled us more than the winter wind, that this was not an end. It was an intermission. The corruption of his innocence was complete, and the stage was now set for a far darker and more terrifying act to begin. The isolation of his home, we would soon learn, was not a barrier to his obsession, but a crucible for it. The confinement of Alistair Finch to his family's estate did not bring the peace for which the village of Blackwood so desperately yearned. If anything, his removal from public view only amplified the dread. He was like a poison that, once drawn from a wound, still courses invisibly through the blood. The Finch property, once a symbol of prosperity, became a place of dark speculation. The tall pines that bordered their land seemed to stand as sentinels for some unspeakable secret, and the smoke that curled from their chimney felt like a signal of some private, infernal industry. For a year, we saw little of him. Arthur Finch became a grim, solitary figure at the mill, his face set in a permanent mask of stoic endurance. Eleanor ceased attending church altogether, and the few who caught a glimpse of her on her rare visits to the general store spoke of a woman aged beyond her years, her eyes hollow, her movements those of a sleepwalker. We offered prayers for them, of course, but they were prayers uttered from a safe distance, tinged more with fear than with Christian charity. It was during this period of uneasy quiet that the first of the larger animals began to vanish. It started with livestock. Old Man Peabody's prize milking ewe was found in a far pasture, not merely dead, but disassembled. The word spread through the village in hushed, horrified whispers. The animal had been opened with a precision that spoke of a knowledge of anatomy far beyond any butcher's skill. Organs had been carefully removed and laid out upon the grass in a manner that was both methodical and deeply sacrilegious. There were no tooth marks, no signs of a predator's attack. Just a chilling, intelligent cruelty. Then it was the hunting dogs. 2 of Samuel Carter's best coonhounds, famed for their tracking ability, failed to return from a run. They were discovered a day later in a shallow creek bed. Their cause of death was a mystery. No visible wounds, no signs of struggle, but their bodies had been arranged in a pose of mock combat, their lips pulled back from their teeth in ghastly snarls. The village constable, a practical man not given to fancy, declared it the work of a particularly vicious bobcat, but his eyes betrayed his own disbelief. The air in Blackwood grew thick with a tension that was as palpable as the mountain mist. I felt a responsibility, as his former teacher, to attempt one final intervention. On a bleak afternoon in the autumn of 1875, I gathered my courage and walked up the long, winding lane to the Finch house. The property was unnaturally quiet. No birds sang in the trees. Arthur answered my knock, his large frame filling the doorway, his expression one of weary resignation. He did not invite me in, but he did not turn me away. "He is in his room, Master Thorn," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He spends most of his time there now. Reading. Drawing." He hesitated, and a shadow of profound confusion crossed his face. "He asks for strange things sometimes. Both certain types of plants from the apothecary. I do not know what to do." I asked to see him. Arthur led me through the silent house to a door at the end of a long hallway. He unlocked it, a fact that sent a fresh chill through me, and ushered me inside. The room was a revelation of horror. It was not the room of a child, nor even of a madman. It was a laboratory, a scholar's study dedicated to a single, ghastly field of inquiry. The walls were papered not with maps or pictures, but with intricate, beautifully rendered anatomical drawings. But these were not illustrations from a medical text. They were his own creations, depicting the flayed musculature of local wildlife, the skeletal structures of birds and rodents, all rendered with a breathtaking, terrifying accuracy. On a large table by the window lay a series of specimens preserved in jars of murky alcohol: a fox's paw, the segmented spine of a snake, the perfectly preserved head of a barn owl, its eyes milky and fixed. In the center of the room, standing calmly before an easel, was Alistair. He had grown taller, paler. His fair hair was longer, and his eyes, those pale blue eyes, held a depth of knowledge that was utterly alien. He showed no surprise at my visit. "Master Thorn," he said, his voice calm and even. "I was just completing a study of the carrion beetle's digestive process. It is a marvel of efficiency." I was struck dumb, my gaze traveling from his placid face to the detailed drawing on the easel, a graphic depiction of a dead rabbit in various stages of consumption by insects. I found my voice, though it was weak and tremulous. "Alistair, this is an abomination. This is not knowledge. This is a desecration of God's creation." He tilted his head, a gesture of genuine curiosity. "Is it? To understand the process of decay is to understand the cycle of life itself. Is that not a form of reverence? To see the beauty in the function of a maggot, the purpose in the rot? You taught us that God has a plan for all things. I am merely seeking to understand the mechanics of that plan." His logic was a serpent, coiling around my own beliefs and choking them. There was no anger in him, no defiance, only this cold, unassailable rationality applied to the most profane of subjects. I tried to appeal to his humanity, to speak of his mother's grief, his father's shame. He listened politely, but his expression remained one of mild, detached interest, as if I were describing the emotional tribulations of characters in a novel he had not found particularly engaging. I left that room a quarter of an hour later, my spirit shattered. I had looked into the eyes of the boy I had once taught and seen no boy at all. I had seen a void, a consciousness that observed the world of living, feeling things as nothing more than a complex series of biological machines, fascinating in their construction and their failure. The solitude had not cured him, it had refined him. It had provided him with the time and space to hone his obsession into a chilling philosophy. As I walked back down the lane, the lock clicking shut behind me felt like the ceiling of a tomb. The monster was not merely contained, it was being perfected. And the knowledge that it was still growing, still learning, behind the locked door of that quiet, respectable house, was a fear far greater than any specter or woodland beast. The crucible of solitude had forged something we were no longer equipped to understand, let alone control. The stage was set, and the next act, we would soon learn, would involve players far more significant than livestock. The year that followed my visit to the Finch household was a slow descent into a collective nightmare for Blackwood. The isolated incidents with livestock ceased, but this brought no comfort. The silence felt deliberate, a predator conserving its energy for larger game. The village existed in a state of suspended dread, every strange sound in the night, every missing chicken, every rustle in the woods attributed to the Finch boy, though he was never seen. He had become our local specter, a folklore of fear woven from whispers and grim speculation. The first human tragedy to be laid at his door, albeit indirectly, was that of his own mother. Eleanor Finch, long hollowed out by grief and terror, was found by her husband on a bright May morning, drowned in the shallow, crystal-clear waters of the creek that ran behind their property. The coroner from the distant town of Millerton ruled it a tragic accident, perhaps a fall while sketching the water lilies that bloomed there. But Arthur Finch knew the truth, and in his profound despair, he confessed it to me one evening, a broken man seeking absolution I could not grant. He told me that on the night before her death, Eleanor had gone to Alistair's room, driven by some final, desperate maternal impulse. She had found him not drawing nor reading, but simply standing at his window, looking out toward the creek. When she asked what he was doing, he had replied without turning, "I am calculating the water's volume, its current speed, and the average weight of a woman of your stature and bone density. I am estimating how long it would take for you to lose consciousness if you were to fall face down into it. The variables are quite fascinating." Arthur found her there the next morning, her watercolor pad and paints lying neatly on the bank, as if she had simply decided to test his hypothesis. Whether it was suicide or a final, terrible loss of will to live, we would never know. But the village, when it learned of the circumstances, held no doubt. Alistair had not pushed her, but he had, with his cold, clinical words, mapped the path to her death, and she had walked it. He had harvested his first human soul without ever lifting a finger. This event marked a turning point. Arthur Finch, now a widower haunted by twin ghosts, seemed to lose his final battle with whatever demon possessed his son. He began to drink heavily, and the mill fell into disrepair. The boy was given the run of the property, his confinement now effectively over. It was then that the real disappearances began. The first was a trapper named Silas Pope, a rugged, solitary man who knew the mountains better than any. He ventured into the high country and never returned. Search parties found his camp looted, his traps sprung, but no sign of the man. The only oddity was a patch of ground near his cold fire pit, where the pine needles had been swept away to reveal the earth, upon which was drawn, with a stick, a perfect, intricate diagram of a human ribcage. The second was a young girl, Marianne Teague, only 12 years of age. She had gone to pick blackberries at the edge of the Finch property and vanished. The entire village turned out to search for her. It was I, drawn by a foul smell to a dry well long since covered over by brush, who found her. She was not mangled, not torn asunder as the animals had been. That was the most horrifying part. She was laid out with a dreadful neatness, her hands folded over her chest, her berry basket placed beside her. But her eyes were gone, neatly removed, and in their place rested two smooth, gray river stones. Her death was attributed to a fall, but the mutilation, that was the work of something else. Something that saw a human child not as a being to be mourned, but as a specimen to be curated. The evidence was always circumstantial. A child's testimony of seeing a pale boy near the Teague property. A single, small footprint in the mud near Silas Pope's camp that matched no hunting boot. The knowledge, shared in terrified whispers, of what Alistair was capable of. But without concrete proof, the constable was powerless. Arthur Finch, a shell of a man, would only stare blankly and mutter, "You cannot accuse a boy of such things. You cannot." The atmosphere in Blackwood became unbreathable. Parents kept their children indoors after dark. Men went armed to their fields. We were a community imprisoned by our own fear, held captive by a boy of 14 who moved through the shadows of our town like a rumor given flesh. The church was full each Sunday, but the prayers felt like desperate incantations hurled against a darkness that was no longer supernatural, but horrifyingly natural, a flaw in the very character of creation. We had watched a child transform into a predator, and we had stood by, paralyzed by our own inability to comprehend the evil growing in our midst. The harvest of shadows was upon us, and the yield was the soul of our village. The stage was now set for the final, cataclysmic act, one that would leave no room for doubt or denial, and forever sear the name of Alistair Finch into the cursed history of our land. The boy who asked about the falling sparrow had become the hawk, and we were all now merely potential subjects in his boundless, terrible curiosity. The grim winter of 1876–77 shall forever be etched into the memory of Blackwood as the season the Lord, in his inscrutable wisdom, truly turned his face from us. It was a time of profound darkness, both without and within, as if the very soul of our community had been extracted, leaving behind a hollow, frozen shell. The disappearances of Silas Pope and little Marianne Teague had cast a pall of such profound terror that the social fabric of our village, once tightly woven with shared hardship and faith, began to unravel completely. Neighbor regarded neighbor with suspicion, and the name Finch was uttered only in the lowest of whispers, a curse spoken against the encroaching night. Alistair, now 15, was a ghost haunting the periphery of our lives. He was rarely seen, but his presence was a constant, oppressive weight. On the few occasions he was spotted, a pale, slender figure moving through the skeletal trees at the edge of a field, or standing motionless on the ridge above his house, a collective shudder would pass through the village. He was no longer a boy, but a young man, and the quiet intensity about him had matured into something far more formidable, a chilling aura of absolute self-possession. He was a scholar of death, and we, the living, were the population he studied. The final descent into absolute horror began with the dogs. Not their deaths, but their behavior. Throughout that January, the hounds and shepherds of Blackwood would, with no warning, erupt into fits of barking and howling directed toward the Finch property. This was not the excited yelping at a passing squirrel, but a low, guttural, fear-laden sound, the kind of noise a dog makes when it senses a predator it knows it cannot fight. They would cower, their tails tucked, their hackles raised, staring into the deep shadows of the pines as if beholding a wolf of unimaginable size. Old Man Hemlock, our grave-digger, a man not given to fancy, stated flatly, "The beasts see what we cannot. They smell the corruption on the air." Then, on the night of February 2nd, the storm hit. It was a blizzard of biblical ferocity, screaming down from the peaks and burying Blackwood under a suffocating blanket of snow. The world was reduced to a howling whiteness, and all human activity ceased. It was during the storm's peak, when no sane soul would venture forth, that the Miller family vanished. Jacob Miller, his wife Beatrice, and their 2 young sons, simply disappeared from their isolated cabin on the outskirts of the village. They were not discovered missing until 2 days later, when the storm abated and Jacob failed to appear for his shift at the idle mill. A search party was organized, though a sense of grim futility hung over the men as we trudged through the chest-high drifts toward the Miller cabin. What we found there remains, to this day, the most profoundly unsettling scene I have ever witnessed, a tableau of such calculated horror that it defied all human understanding. The cabin was intact, locked from the inside. Forcing the door, we were met not with the stench of death, but with an eerie, sterile cleanliness. A fire had been laid in the hearth but never lit. The table was set for a meal that was never eaten. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no disorder of any kind. It was in the boy's small bedroom that we found the only clue. Laid out with meticulous care upon the elder boy's pillow was a collection of objects. A single, dead crow, its feathers perfectly preened. A lock of Beatrice Miller's distinctive auburn hair, tied with a neat ribbon. The spectacles belonging to Jacob Miller, their lenses polished to a brilliant shine, and a small, whittled wooden horse that belonged to the younger son. They were arranged not randomly, but with a terrible symmetry, like artifacts in a museum display. It was a collection, a trophy case. And it was a message as clear as it was vile. I have taken them. They are mine to study. The village erupted in a frenzy of terror and rage. All pretense of doubt or circumstantial evidence vanished. A mob, armed with rifles and torches and fueled by a primal need for vengeance, formed and marched upon the Finch property. I went with them, not out of bloodlust, but as a witness and perhaps, in some small, desperate part of my soul, hoping to finally see some flicker of the boy I had once known, some shred of humanity to explain the abomination he had become. We found Arthur Finch first. He was hanging from a beam in his own barn, his body swaying gently in the cold air, a suicide. The ultimate surrender. The house was silent. We stormed it, our boots tracking snow and mud across the fine rugs, our shouts echoing in the unnerving stillness. We found Alistair in his room, of course. He was standing by his work table, upon which lay a series of new, freshly inked drawings. These were not of animals. They were detailed, anatomical studies of human subjects. Studies of the Miller family. He showed no fear as the armed, angry men filled his doorway. He turned and looked at us, his pale blue eyes moving from face to face, and in them I saw not defiance, but a faint, academic interest, as if we were a new and unpredictable species of insect that had just crawled into his view. Samuel Carter, the constable, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and terror, demanded, "Boy, where are the Millers? What have you done with them?" Alistair regarded him for a long moment, then gestured to the drawings on his table. "I am documenting the process," he said, his voice as calm and even as it had been in my schoolhouse. "It is a far more complex variable than the fauna. The emotional responses, in particular, introduce fascinating physiological reactions. The fear, the grief, it alters the chemical composition of the blood, you see. It sweetens it." A roar of fury went up from the men. They surged forward, grabbing him. He did not struggle. He did not cry out. As they dragged him from the room, his eyes met mine for a final time. There was no plea in them, no recognition, no remorse. There was only the cold, placid surface of a deep, dark well, and in its depths, I saw the reflection of our own damned and horrified faces. We had captured the monster, but we had not slain the abomination. For the abomination was not in his hands, nor in his actions. It was in his soul, a void where a human heart should have been, and that was a horror from which there could be no escape, for him, or for any of us who had borne witness to its birth and terrible maturation. The boy science couldn't explain was now our collective burden, our eternal curse, and the silence that followed his capture was more terrifying than any scream. The capture of Alistair Finch did not bring catharsis, but rather inaugurated a new, more profound layer of torment for Blackwood. The immediate, fiery rage of the mob cooled into a hard, icy dread as the practical and moral implications of our situation settled upon us. We had a monster in our custody, but he was a boy of 15, and we were men of God and law, or so we told ourselves. We could not simply string him up from the nearest tree, though many a voice in the general store that week argued vehemently for such Old Testament justice. We had to have a trial. We had to have order. It was all that separated us from the chaos he represented. The village constable, Samuel Carter, a man whose sense of duty was at war with his revulsion, locked Alistair in the single, stone-walled cell in the basement of the town hall. It was a space meant for drunks and the occasional brawler, not for a creature like this. The problem of what to do next was debated with frantic intensity. Sending for the county sheriff meant exposing our shame, our failure, and inviting the outside world into our private nightmare. We were a proud people, and the thought of gawking officials and sensationalist newspapermen descending upon Blackwood was anathema. A council was formed. Myself, Reverend Mathis, Constable Carter, and a few other elders. We stood in the cramped, lamplit office above the cell, our breath misting in the cold air, and debated the fate of the boy who listened to our every word in the silence below. "We must send for the authorities in Millerton," Carter insisted, his face haggard. "This is beyond us. This is a matter for the state." "And what will they do?" countered Josiah Prentice, the owner of the general store. "Put him in an asylum? He will speak his poison to doctors, and they will write papers on him, and our name, Blackwood, will be forever tied to this abomination. Our children will be marked by it. Our timber will be unsellable. We will become a carnival of horror." Reverend Mathis, his hands trembling as he held his Bible, spoke in a hollow voice. "The soul is God's to judge, but the protection of the flock is my charge. This presence is a blight upon us. It is a poison in our soil. I have sat with him, I have attempted to pray with him. He listens to Scripture with the same interest he might afford a recipe for stew. He analyzes the metaphors of Christ's sacrifice as if they were mathematical theorems. There is no soul there to save, only a mind, a terrible, brilliant, and empty mind." It was then that the most radical and terrible solution was proposed by old Mr. Hemlock, the gravedigger. He had been silent until that moment, his gnarled hands resting on his knees, his eyes like chips of flint. "There's the old ice house," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "The one cut into the hill behind the church. Stone walls, stone floor, a single iron door. It's been dry for a decade. Deeper than a well and as cold as a grave." He looked around at our faces, his gaze uncompromising. "We built this town with our own hands. We solve our own problems. This is our problem. We don't need the outside world. We need a permanent solution." A stunned silence filled the room. He was not suggesting an execution. He was suggesting an entombment. "You cannot mean to bury a boy alive," I whispered, aghast. "I mean to contain a plague," Hemlock retorted. "You heard the Reverend. There's no soul to save. What walks in that boy's skin is a contagion. We build a wall. We seal the door. We tell the world he ran off into the woods after his father's suicide, and the wolves got him. And we pray to God to forgive us for the sin we are about to commit to save our families." The debate that followed was the most agonizing of my life. It was a choice between the law of man and the brutal, primal law of survival. We were no longer judging a child. We were diagnosing a disease and seeking to quarantine it. The memory of the Miller family's vacant cabin, of the little river stones in Marianne Teague's eye sockets, of Eleanor Finch's broken body in the creek, hung over us all. Fear, in the end, is a more potent motivator than justice. The decision was made in the small hours of the morning. It was unanimous. We would become his jailers, and his tomb would be of our own making. The following night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Alistair was taken from his cell. He offered no resistance. He was led, calm and placid, to the old ice house, a squat, stone structure built into a hillside, its iron door rusted but stout. He paused at the threshold, looking not at us, but at the darkness within, as if assessing his new accommodations. "It is adequately sized for the experiment," he remarked, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness. Those were the last words any of us heard him speak. He walked inside of his own volition. We then set to work, our hearts pounding with a shame that threatened to stop them. We mixed mortar and we bricked up the doorway, layer by layer, sealing the iron door behind a foot-thick wall of stone and lime. The sound of the trowels scraping, the soft thud of the bricks being set into place, was the only sound in the night. It was the sound of a community damming itself. With each brick laid, I felt a piece of my own humanity being walled up in that dark, cold hole with him. When it was done, we stood back, a group of exhausted, haunted men. There was no sound from within. No pounding, no cries. Only a silence that was more absolute than any I had ever known. We had enacted our judgment. We had used stone and silence to answer a horror that had no name. We had saved Blackwood, but we had sacrificed our souls to do it. We walked away from that hillside not as victors, but as accomplices, bound together by a secret so terrible that it would ensure our silence for the rest of our days. The boy whose science couldn't explain was now a problem for the earth itself, and we were left to wander the surface above him, forever wondering if, in our desperation, we had buried a monster or created something infinitely worse. The sealing of Alistair Finch within the old icehouse brought no peace to Blackwood. If anything, the act cast a longer, darker shadow than the boy's freedom ever had. We had committed an atrocity in the name of self-preservation, and the guilt clung to the village like a persistent, foul miasma. The official story was disseminated with a grim uniformity. Alistair, unhinged by his father's suicide, had fled into the wilderness during the night, and despite extensive searches, no trace had been found. It was a tale born of necessity, but it rang hollow in the ears of those who told it. The mill, now ownerless, fell into complete disrepair, its silent, skeletal structure a constant reminder of the family that had been consumed by the darkness they nurtured. For the first few months, a tense, watchful quiet prevailed. Men would avoid the path that led near the icehouse, giving the hillside a wide berth, their eyes darting nervously toward the bricked-up entrance. Children were warned never to play in that area, the threat of wolves and bad spirits now carrying a terrifying, specific weight. Reverend Mathis's sermons took on a new tone, focusing heavily on themes of God's ultimate judgment, the burden of secret sin, and the fragility of a community's soul. He no longer met his congregation's eyes with the same fatherly warmth, and they, in turn, could not look at him without seeing one of the men who had laid the bricks that entombed a boy alive. Then the sounds began. It started subtly, as these things often do. A farmer, checking his traps near the hillside, would hear a faint, rhythmic scraping, like a nail being dragged slowly across stone. He dismissed it as a tree branch, though no trees grew near the icehouse. A woman fetching water from the well behind the church swore she heard a low, humming vibration coming from the ground, a tuneless drone that set her teeth on edge. These reports were initially brushed aside as nerves, the product of guilty consciences. But they persisted and they grew. By the autumn of 1877, the phenomena could no longer be ignored. On still nights, a sound would emanate from the hillside, a soft, methodical tapping. It was not the frantic pounding of a prisoner trying to escape. It was something far worse, a patient, persistent tapping, as if someone inside were conducting a long-term experiment on the acoustic properties of stone and mortar, or perhaps communicating in a code only they understood. The dogs of the village, which had once howled at Alistair's presence, now whined and cowered when the tapping began, pressing their bodies against the legs of their owners for a comfort that was not forthcoming. The psychological toll was devastating. The community, already fractured by fear, now began to crumble under the weight of its collective secret and the unnerving auditory haunting from the hillside. Families who had lived in Blackwood for generations began to speak in earnest of leaving. The Prescott family was the first to go, packing their wagon and departing for Millerton in the dead of night, leaving their house and fields behind without a backward glance. Others followed. The population, which had already been dwindling, began a rapid decline. The schoolhouse, which I had presided over for decades, saw its numbers halved, then halved again, until I was teaching a mere handful of children, their faces pale and their eyes old with a knowledge no child should possess. I found myself drawn to the icehouse, a moth to a cursed flame. I would stand at a distance, listening to that infernal tapping, and my mind would conjure images of what was happening within. Was he still alive? Had he somehow found a source of water, of food? Or was this something else? A psychic resonance, the sound of a monstrous will persisting beyond the limits of the flesh? I remembered his words, his calm discourse on the experiment of his confinement. Was this tapping part of some vast, incomprehensible data collection? The not knowing was a torture in itself. The final, most chilling event occurred on the first anniversary of his interment. A deep cold had settled over Blackwood, and a fresh layer of snow covered the ground. I was walking home from the empty schoolhouse when I saw a figure standing by the icehouse. My heart seized in my chest. It was a young woman, her back to me, her dark hair flowing down her back. As I drew closer, my blood ran cold. It was Sarah Miller, the younger sister of the vanished Jacob Miller. She was standing mere feet from the bricked-up entrance, her head cocked as if listening intently. "Sarah," I called out, my voice sharp with alarm. She turned slowly, and her face was not her own. It was a mask of serene, vacant absorption. In her hands, she held a small, dead sparrow. "He's teaching me," she said, her voice a dreamy whisper. "He explains how it works. The bones. The hollow spaces. He says it's all just engineering." I rushed her away from that accursed place, my mind reeling. The entity in the ice house was no longer content to be a prisoner. It was reaching out, finding a vulnerable mind, a grieving, impressionable young woman, and whispering its blasphemous curriculum. We had not contained the horror. We had only given it a focal point, a dark nucleus around which the remaining sanity of Blackwood slowly disintegrated. The boy we had walled up was gone, but the professor of death remained, and his classroom had expanded to include the entire dying village. The haunting was not one of ghosts, but of ideas, a virulent philosophy of emptiness that was seeping through the stone and into our very souls. The incident with Sarah Miller marked a point of no return. The horror was no longer confined to the physical realm of missing persons and mutilated animals, nor was it limited to the psychological torment of faint, unnerving sounds in the night. It had become a spiritual pestilence, a canker that was actively spreading through the vulnerable hearts and minds of our dwindling community. Sarah was placed under the strict watch of her remaining family, but the damage was done. The mere knowledge that the entity in the ice house could exert such influence, that its cold, analytical consciousness could reach out from its stone prison and touch another, shattered the last vestiges of felt security in Blackwood. I took it upon myself to become Sarah's unofficial keeper, a penance for my role in creating the monster that now haunted her. I would sit with her for hours in the parlor of the Miller house, now a place of shadows and memories, and try to draw her back to the world of the living. She would alternate between periods of catatonic silence and bursts of chillingly lucid discourse. "He doesn't speak in words, not like you or I," she explained one afternoon, her gaze fixed on the frost ferns blooming on the windowpane. "It's more like an understanding that appears in your mind." He showed me the sparrow. Not the dead one I held, but the one in my mind. He showed me how its wings are a system of levers and pulleys, how its tiny heart is a perfect, efficient pump. He made me see the beauty in its stillness, in the perfection of its design when it is no longer troubled by the messy business of life. I tried to counter with scripture, with poetry, with any words that celebrated the soul, the spirit, the ineffable mystery of life. But my words felt like chaff before the wind of this terrible, logical revelation. Alistair's philosophy was a perversion of natural philosophy, a reduction of all of God's creation to mere machinery, and in its cold, clear light, concepts like love, grief, and sin seemed like sentimental fictions. He was not arguing against God. He was rendering him irrelevant, a mere initial clockmaker who had wound up the universe and stepped away. The tapping from the ice house continued, a maddening, metronomic counterpoint to our lives. It was no longer just a sound, it was a presence, a heartbeat at the center of our village. Some claimed it changed in rhythm, that it grew faster when someone new fell ill, or slower and more deliberate when a storm was approaching, as if it were monitoring us, collecting data on the correlation between atmospheric pressure and human anxiety. The wild animals seemed to agree with this assessment. The woods around the ice house became a dead zone. No deer foraged there, no birds nested in the trees. It was as if the entire animal kingdom had given the hillside a wide berth, recognizing it as a place of absolute existential wrongness. The social decay accelerated. With the mill silent and families fleeing, the local economy collapsed. Those who remained were the poorest, the oldest, and the most stubborn, bound to Blackwood by generations of history or a lack of anywhere else to go. The general store's shelves grew bare and were never restocked. We became a community of subsistence, living off our root cellars and what few animals we had left, our world shrinking to the muddy street and the ever-present view of that damned hillside. We stopped holding town meetings. What was there to discuss? Our only business was survival, and our only shared experience was a dread we could not speak aloud. Reverend Mathis, the man who had been our moral compass, was among the most broken. I found him one evening in the empty church, not at the pulpit, but sitting in a pew, staring at the cross above the altar as if it were a mathematical equation he could no longer solve. "I have spent my life speaking of the soul, Elias," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "I have preached of its eternal nature, its battle between sin and grace. But that thing in the hill, it has no soul. I have looked into its eyes. It is a void. And a void cannot be saved, it can only be filled. Or contained. And I fear we have failed at both." He confessed to me that he too heard the tapping, not just with his ears, but in his dreams. He said it was arranging itself into patterns, like a language of geometry, and that he was beginning, against his will, to understand it. "It is teaching me the geometry of despair, Elias. It is showing me that faith is merely an inefficient shape, a structural weakness in the face of entropy." It was then that I truly understood the depth of our peril. Alistair was not merely a physical threat or a psychological one. He was a metaphysical pathogen. His influence was a slow-acting acid, dissolving the very foundations of belief and meaning that held a community together. He was proving his thesis, not through argument, but through a relentless, passive demonstration of his own nature. He was the embodiment of a universe without purpose, without love, without a moral compass, and his mere existence, even entombed, was enough to make that vision seep into our reality. The final act of the Reverend's personal tragedy came on a Sunday morning in the deep of winter. He climbed into his pulpit before the 24 souls who remained of his congregation. He looked out at our gaunt, haunted faces, opened his Bible, and was silent for a full minute. Then he closed the book with a definitive snap. "There are no sermons left," he said, his voice clear and terribly calm. "There is only the data. There is only the experiment." He then stepped down from the pulpit, walked out of the church, and proceeded directly to the ice house. We watched, paralyzed, as he took a piece of chalk from his pocket and began to draw on the bricked-up entrance. He drew complex, interlocking shapes, circles within triangles, spirals that terminated in sharp, angular lines. It was not the work of a madman. It was the work of a student, meticulously copying the notes of a brilliant, inhuman teacher. When he was finished, he simply sat down on the frozen ground, cross-legged, facing his artwork, and fell into a silence from which he never emerged. He was found there the next day, frozen to death, a final, willing subject in the terrible study of the boy we had buried. The canker had claimed its most devout opponent, and in doing so, it had won. Blackwood was no longer a village haunted by a secret. It was a laboratory, and we were all, now, specimens in the grand, awful experiment of Alistair Finch. The death of Reverend Mathis broke the last fragile thread of order in Blackwood. His frozen, contorted body, seated in a posture of scholarly attention before the chalk-scrawled icehouse, was a blasphemy that could not be prayed away. The remaining few dozen souls looked upon that scene and saw not the end of a man, but the triumph of the entity in the hill. The church doors were nailed shut. There were no more services, no more community gatherings. We had become a scattering of isolated outposts, each household a fortress under siege from an enemy that was both within and without, a pervasive dread that had solidified into a tangible, crushing presence. The winter of 1878 was the most brutal of all. It was as if the land itself had turned against us, conspiring with the horror we had entombed. Blizzard after blizzard scoured the village, piling snow into impassable drifts that sealed us in a white, soundless tomb of our own. It was during this period of absolute isolation that the phenomena escalated from the auditory to the physical. The soft, methodical tapping that had been our torment for over a year ceased. The silence that replaced it was, if possible, even more terrifying. It was the silence of a predator that has finished its stalk and is now poised to strike. The first to vanish in this new phase was Old Man Hemlock, the gravedigger who had proposed the entombment. He was found not in his bed, but in the cemetery, his body arranged with a ghastly precision atop a fresh grave. His tools, his spade and pick, were laid beside him, polished to a high sheen. There was no visible cause of death, but his face was fixed in a rictus of such profound terror that it was clear his heart had simply ceased out of sheer fright. The snow around him was undisturbed, save for a single set of small, bare footprints that led from the direction of the icehouse and ended at his body. The message was unmistakable. The jailer had been visited by his prisoner. Panic, cold and sharp, finally gave way to a desperate, collective resolve. We could not live like this any longer, waiting to be picked off one by a horror we had ourselves created. A meeting was called in my home, the schoolhouse being too full of painful memories. The faces that gathered around my hearth were those of the last holdouts, men and women hardened by grief and fear into a grim determination. "We have to know," Samuel Carter said, his voice hollow. The constable's authority was long gone, replaced by the haunted look of a man who has seen the laws of nature repealed. "We have to open it. We have to see what we have made in there." There was no dissent. The fear of what we might find was now lesser than the terror of not knowing. And so, on a morning so cold the air itself seemed to crackle, we gathered at the icehouse. We were a pitiful army, a handful of farmers, a broken constable, and a schoolmaster, armed with sledgehammers, crowbars, and a single, shared, suffocating dread. The work of breaking down the wall we had so carefully built was grueling and surreal. Each blow of the sledgehammer against the mortar felt like a physical blow against our own sanity. The bricks, once laid with such grim purpose, now came down with a shower of dust and crumbling lime. As the opening grew, a smell wafted out that stopped us in our tracks. It was not the stench of decay we had feared, but a dry, cold, metallic odor, like the air in a deep cave, mixed with something else, something sharp and chemical, reminiscent of the apothecary's shop. When the hole was large enough, Samuel Carter, his revolver drawn with a trembling hand, was the first to peer inside. He stood there for a long moment, utterly still, before stumbling back, his face as white as the snow around us. He did not speak, but simply pointed, his hand shaking uncontrollably. I took a lantern and stepped forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. I thrust the light into the opening, and what I saw there will be etched upon my mind until my dying day. The icehouse was not a tomb. It was a study. The walls, from floor to the vaulted ceiling, were covered in a breathtaking, horrifying mural. But it was not painted with pigments. It was drawn in a medium I could not, at first, identify, a mixture of soot, crushed minerals, and something dark and brown that flaked away in places. The drawings were anatomical and geometrical masterpieces, depicting the complete skeletal and muscular systems of every creature that had ever crossed Alistair's path: the wolf, the hounds, the squirrels, the birds. And there, in the center, were human figures, rendered with the same chilling precision. I recognized the muscular structure of Silas Pope, the trapper. I saw the delicate bone structure of Marianne Teague. The drawings were so accurate, so laden with a knowledge that defied his isolation, that it seemed impossible. But the centerpiece of this chamber of horrors was the floor. In the very center of the room, seated cross-legged on the stone, was Alistair. He was little more than a skeleton clad in parchment-thin skin, his hair long and matted, his eyes closed. He was clearly, undeniably, dead. He had been for some time. And yet, the scene was not one of desolation. Arranged around him in concentric circles were hundreds of small, bleached bones, the bones of the animals he had studied. They were not scattered, they were placed with meticulous care, forming a complex, spiral pattern that radiated out from his body. In his lap lay a final, large drawing. It was a self-portrait, a flayed depiction of his own anatomy, every muscle and tendon rendered in gruesome, loving detail. And scrawled beneath it, in the same dark, flaking medium, was a single, stark sentence. "The experiment is concluded. The data is complete." We stood in silence, the freezing air pouring from the open tomb. The monster was dead. The horror was over. But the mystery had only deepened into an abyss. How had he drawn these things in total darkness? What was the source of his impossible anatomical knowledge? And most chilling of all, if Alistair Finch had been dead for months, who, or what, had been tapping on the walls? Who had whispered into Sarah Miller's mind? Who had killed Old Man Hemlock? We had exhumed a body, but the truth we uncovered was far more terrifying than the monster we had sought. We had not contained a boy. We had incubated an idea, a presence, that had outlasted its physical host. The experiment, it seemed, was far from concluded. We had simply graduated from being its wardens to being its final, living specimens. The horror was not in the ice house. It was in us and in the land, and it was now a permanent, ineradicable part of Blackwood. The discovery of Alistair Finch's desiccated corpse within his ghastly chapel of knowledge did not bring the closure we so desperately craved. If anything, it plunged us into a deeper, more profound abyss of understanding. The tangible, physical threat was gone, reduced to bones and dust in that frozen sepulchre. But the phenomena that had haunted us, the relentless, methodical tapping, the psychic whispers that corroded the mind, the unseen influence that arranged dead animals and guided the living to their doom, had persisted for months after his heart had stilled. This fact was an axe blow to the foundation of reality as we knew it. We had not been fighting a monster of flesh and blood, but something far more terrifying. An idea given form, a principle of avoidance that had used the boy as its temporary vessel. The vessel was shattered, but the essence, it seemed, had simply lingered. A frantic, terrified council was held at the broken entrance of the ice house, the frozen air pouring from that open maw like the breath of a grave. Samuel Carter, his face a mask of utter defeat, voiced what we all felt. It wasn't him. Or it wasn't just him. My God, what have we done? What have we been housing here? The decision was unanimous and born of pure, superstitious terror. We would attempt a purification by fire. It was an act of desperation, a ritual we hoped would scour the metaphysical stain from our land. We gathered fuel, dry timber, lamp oil, and with trembling hands, we built a pyre in the center of that stone chamber. We lifted Alistair's light, skeletal frame, so fragile it seemed it might crumble to dust in our grasp, and placed it upon the wood. We smashed the intricate bone mosaics, the carefully arranged patterns that spoke of a mind seeing the world as mere architecture of decay, and tossed the fragments onto the pile. Lastly, we looked upon the walls. The murals, drawn in what I now realized was a mixture of charcoal, clay, and his own blood, were a masterpiece of blasphemy. The flayed musculature of man and beast, the perfect renderings of skeletal systems, the geometric proofs of mortality, they all seemed to watch us with a silent, knowing contempt. We could not destroy the stone, so we sought to blacken it, to obliterate the art. We doused everything in oil and, with a prayer that stuck in our throats, set the inferno ablaze. The fire roared to life, a contained hell within the stone walls. The flames licked at the drawings, making the exposed muscles and organs seem to twitch and writhe in the flickering light, a final, horrific danse macabre. The smell was indescribable, a pungent mix of burning hair, scorched bone, and that strange, chemical odor that had always clung to him, now amplified 1,000-fold by the heat. We watched until the pyre collapsed into a mound of glowing embers and the walls were blackened with soot, the knowledge they held seemingly erased. Then, with the energy born of sheer panic, we resealed the ice house. We worked through the night, piling stone upon stone, mixing mortar that froze even as we applied it, building a wall twice as thick as the first. It was not a tomb now, it was a monument to our fear, a cairn meant to weigh down a ghost. In the months that followed, a fragile, exhausted silence fell over the ruins of Blackwood. The active, aggressive manifestations ceased. The tapping did not return. The whispers that had coiled through Sarah Miller's mind fell silent. She remained a fragile creature, her spirit permanently bent, but she began to eat and sleep with a semblance of normalcy, though her eyes would forever hold a distant, haunted look, as if she were perpetually listening to a fading echo. The immediate, palpable horror had receded. But the village was dead. The heart had been torn out of it. The great timber mill stood as a rotting skeleton against the sky. The church, with its nailed-shut doors, was a silent judgment upon us all. Of the vibrant community of over 100 souls, only a handful of us remained, the stubborn, the destitute, and the damned, too rooted in this cursed soil to leave, or too broken to try. I have spent these last years as the reluctant archivist of our damnation. In this ledger, by the flickering light of a solitary lamp, I have poured out every memory, every detail, while my mind remains clear enough to distinguish the horrific truth from the nightmares that now plague my sleep. But the very act of writing this chronicle has led me to a terrible and inescapable conclusion. The story of Alistair Finch does not end with his death, nor with the burning of his works. He was never the source, but merely the first and most perfect instrument of a something else, a nullity that found its purest expression through his unique and fractured consciousness. Our act of entombing him did not starve this entity. It focused it, compressed it, forcing it to evolve from physical cruelty to a more refined, psychological and spiritual predation. Our act of burning his library did not destroy the knowledge. It merely scattered the spores of his terrible philosophy on the wind, where they lay dormant, waiting for the right conditions to take root again. This is not mere speculation. Just last week, Timothy Shaw, who was once a boy telling me of a butchered wolf and is now a man with a wife and a son of his own, came to my door. His face was ashen, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold his hat. He told me, in a voice choked with a dread I knew all too well, that his 8-year-old son, Benjamin, had been having vivid, recurring nightmares. In these dreams, the boy claimed, a quiet man came to him. This man never spoke, but he showed Benjamin things. He demonstrated the precise pivot and hinge of a rabbit's leg joint. He illustrated the intricate pulley system of a bird's wing. He revealed the beautiful, interlocking geometry of a fish's spine. The knowledge was imparted not with words, but with a direct, chilling clarity. This morning, Timothy said, Benjamin had sat up in his bed, turned to his father with those clear, innocent eyes, and asked a question in a tone of calm, scientific curiosity that froze the blood in Timothy's veins. "Papa," the boy asked, "what does it feel like when a soul comes out? Is there a sound? Does it look like smoke?" I looked into Timothy's terrified eyes and saw the reflection of my own ultimate despair. The cycle is beginning anew. The data, it seems, was not complete. The experiment was merely on hiatus, and now it resumes with a new subject, a new variable. The legacy of Alistair Finch is not a ghost story to be told and forgotten. It is a living, breathing curse, a pattern of thought, a virulent strain of curiosity about the dark, underlying mechanics of life and death that has now, it seems, found a new, fertile and vulnerable mind in which to incubate. I am an old man now. My hands are gnarled, my sight is failing. I will soon be buried in the Blackwood cemetery, in the plot I have reserved next to the empty spaces that symbolically hold the Millers, the Teagues, the Popes, and all the other victims. I will take my place in the grand, awful data set that began with a boy's question about a sparrow. And as I lay down this pen for the final time, the ink staining my fingers as the grave's earth soon will, I am left with the most chilling and unanswerable question of all, a question that ensures this horror will live long after my own heart has stilled. Was Alistair Finch a singular, inexplicable anomaly, a one in a billion aberration that science could never hope to explain? Or was he, in fact, a precursor? The first, early bloom of a new and terrible understanding of the universe, one that is cold, mechanical, and devoid of spirit, an understanding that is even now, quietly and patiently, taking root in the innocent soil of another child's mind, here in the perpetual, watchful silence of Blackwood? I do not know the answer. I fear the answer more than I have ever feared anything. I only know that the silence here is no longer empty. It is observant. It is analytical. It is patient. And it is forever learning.